Today I will be presenting Jon Skeet. Jon Skeet is a famous person in the .NET community from Stack Overflow by his helpful posts that solve problems for a lot of people for many years, and from his famous book C# in depth. Jon Skeet is a staff engineer at Google, working on Google Platform client libraries for .NET, working from home in Reading. He's as I said, known for his contributions in the community and help for many thousands of developers on Stack Overflow platform. Outside of software, Jon is committed Christian and enjoys theater, particularly music theater, playing board games and spending time with his amazing family. So, please welcome Jon and his talk, How Do You Think When You're Coding?
Thank you for having me today. Just as an intro to this talk and sort of what we're thinking about today, that introduction mentioned my Christian faith and an interest in theatre, and that's been those have been combined with what I've been doing in software for the last few years, running the audio video system for my local church, which has got me really into all of the AV side of things, and working on that a lot in my free time, and obviously continuing to work normally, I've started reflecting on how I go about thinking, what my thought processes are when I'm coding and how they vary depending on what I'm working on. And so basically I'm going to describe that today, and that's very much how I think when I'm coding, but the intention is that you will all think about how you think when you're coding, and maybe some of the ideas that I present will ring true and be similar to how you think, and some may be entirely different, because we are all really different. We think differently, and I definitely don't want to impose my personal practices on you. That's not the intention whatsoever. However, I do think it's useful to think about how you think when you're coding, reflect on when things have gone well, when things have gone badly. I'm now, having put together this talk and delivered it a couple of times, I'm more aware when I'm sort of going against my own ideas of best practice of what works for me, and I can then sort of adjust. And so I think being conscious of how you work well really can help to improve your productivity. So just as a reminder, we are all very different, and it's worth, if you're collaborating with other people, it's worth knowing how they work as well. If some people find that they don't get much out of meetings, things in meetings don't really land and they don't remember them, maybe after a meeting send them an email saying, this is what I think we agreed to do, or the reverse, if someone finds that just reading documents, things don't really end up lodged in their brain, then maybe have a meeting and just go through the document that you've written. Perhaps, you know, people have different ways of remembering things. Some people will want to be very focused on a single task for an entire day, and other people are happy to chop and change. Be aware of your colleagues' diversity of thinking. Okay, so for me, I am personally awful at genuine multitasking. If you ask me to talk to someone and review a document at the same time, or write some code and do something else, it's really, really not good. I find that I'll put a podcast on while doing something that should be fairly trivial, and reflect later on that I've no idea what the podcast was about, because I've just not been able to listen and do the other task at the same time. So I'm rubbish at true multitasking, but I'm very good at quick context switching. And I know other people find that much harder, but I tend to find that I'm working on lots of different things roughly at the same time, and that's both in work and in my personal life. And so I keep a task list of lots of fairly small tasks, and the idea is that I can do each of those tasks in one chunk, then potentially context switch to something entirely different and do something else. But I really need to make sure that when I've got a task, I know what it means and what it means to do it fully, and I've got this idea of different modes that I end up in. Excuse me. So broadly speaking, I sort of classify, I don't do this in any sort of formal way. I don't write down next to the task, this is a learn task, this is an explore task. It's not quite like that. But I become conscious of which mode I'm in. So learning, exploring, understanding, those sort of form a set of, we're not trying to produce anything that is going to make it into source control, probably, but it's more to enrich my knowledge. And then fix, enhance, and clean up, those are much more, we'll end up with a pull request. So we'll go into most of the rest of this talk is basically talking about those 6 modes. So what's in a mode anyway? We need to know what we're trying to do, the goal of the mode. We need to know, when I'm in this mode, what works well. So best practices are a bit sort of grander title, and likewise thought processes, but what tends to work well in this mode, and how should I be thinking in this mode? And then finally, what do I expect to get out of it in terms of concrete artifacts? Files on a file system somewhere, probably. So you might wonder why it's worth thinking about these at all. My experience is that if I work in this particular way, then I end up with a code base that's got a clean commit history, which matters to me quite a lot. I don't like merge commits, for example. I always rebase and merge instead of merging with a merge commit, because I like my commit history to just say useful information. Commit messages of WIP, as in work in progress, that's not useful. Commits that do multiple things aren't useful either. So doing things in this fairly organized and disciplined way helps me keep a clean commit history. And then in order to do that, I've really got to work on one thing at a time. So I keep a list of tasks. So this is, you won't be able to read any of it, but just as an example, this is my current list of tasks for personal life, and I have a slightly larger notebook for my work life. And if I notice a bug while I'm doing one thing, I will write down a new task on my task list rather than trying to fix it there and then. Likewise, if I'm learning about something and there's a link to something else that sounds really interesting, well, I don't want to get distracted from that thing that I'm meant to be learning about by the other thing. So I'll write it down as something to do do next. I personally like having a task list so I can tick things off, because ticking boxes gives me a sense of achievement. And also it's really helpful at the end of the week. I typically write my snippets for work, which is, this is what I've been doing this week, which makes it much easier for colleagues to see what I've been up to. And if I've got a task list, I typically start the week with a fairly long task list and it just grows over the week. So I can tell my colleagues, this is what I expect to be doing. So that's all the sort of background bit. Let's look at what these modes actually are. So first is learn mode. So this is when I'm reading about a new language feature in C# or something in ASP.NET Core, a framework feature, learning a whole new framework perhaps, or investigating a new protocol. So I've been working with digital audio mixers a lot for the sake of my church AV system, and some of those are well documented, some are less so, and we'll see the difference that makes in a minute. But basically this is where you're learning from other resources, so existing documentation of some form or another. The best practices here for me, and all of this is for me, and you should learn your own best practices, but I suspect something that's global is starting simple and gradually building up a really solid core of knowledge. I've seen a lot of people try to run very quickly. So in particular, try to create a mobile game with no basic language understanding of Java or C# or whatever they're using. And while I can completely understand I want to write a mobile game as a goal, when you're learning the basics of a language, trying to write for a mobile app is really not very productive because it takes such a long time. There are so many other things to know about. If you're trying to learn about polymorphism, well, in order to show that within a mobile game, there's a lot of setup to start with for your environment, making sure that you can deploy to your app, and all of that is confusing enough, even if you've got nothing else you're doing. Let alone if you have no idea, this is your first time in a language. So starting with the smallest thing, which for me tends to be a console app, is really helpful. Do as much as you can in an environment that has no distractions. Obviously, if you're learning about a particular GUI framework or trying to learn how do I develop in mobile, then that's fine. But don't try to learn how do I develop for mobile and I will learn a dozen new language features all at the same time. It can be really easy to get overwhelmed by just how broad a topic is. So if you can see, okay, I'm learning how to do mobile app development, and at some point I may want to learn how to have a server that stores the state of all my users. Well, you can separate those things out. So keep notes, and I would thoroughly recommend Google Docs or other note-taking facilities are available, but something that is online so that you can access it later if you lose your particular laptop or whatever, and you can just jot down notes. You're not looking for very long-winded, you're not trying to present these notes to anyone else. They only need to make sense to you. They do need to make sense to you potentially in a couple of months' time, but they're fairly informal. And I would also strongly encourage finding good resources and ones that teach you in a way that you like. So personally, I really don't like trying to learn things from YouTube videos. Really popular way of learning doesn't do anything for me. Give me a web page tutorial or a physical book, something that I can go back and forth really easily without having to try to scroll to the right bit of the video, and I'm much happier. Other people really want to see the code developing in front of their eyes, hear a voice. That our brains are wired differently. Learn in whatever way makes sense for you, but do try to find good resources. You'll notice some tells of bad resources, code that doesn't actually work, or even on a YouTube video you'll see, oh well, this code should be fine, but it's got a load of warnings. And it's like, do I really want to be learning from this person if they produce code that's full of warnings? Obviously, if they explain the warnings, then that's a bit of a different matter. If you're learning a framework or something similar, then official resources are likely to be more reliable rather than just, well, this is what I've tried and it kind of works, but I'm not sure why kind of resources. So what do I think when I'm in learn mode? Firstly, I try to make sure I know what the resource is trying to teach me, and that should marry up with what you're wanting to learn. Sometimes it will be a part of what you're wanting to learn. I've got 5 bookmarks for different aspects of learning C#12, and okay, what's this first bookmark trying to teach me? Right, go through that. Second bookmark, oh, it's got some things in common with the first one, so maybe I'll skim over that, but check that it does make sense and reinforce what I've learnt before rather than contradicting what I've learnt before. Often there can be fundamentals that it's really hard to do this, but you need to know which fundamentals are going to be relevant to you. And that's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Until you know the thing, how can you know whether you need to know the thing? There have been times where I've tried to learn things and gone down a rabbit hole, spent hours learning about some particular aspect of WPF styling or whatever, and then never needed that. Okay, well, that's a bit of a wasted time. The alternative is you say, okay, well, I'll skip over commanding in WPF because that doesn't sound like I need it. And then later on, you get deeper and deeper and find, I don't understand this anymore because I skipped over the fundamentals earlier on. So try to make sure you do cover all the fundamentals you really do need to know, but work out which bits you can skip. and then try to check that you've understood things. And this is where I would recommend going away from copy pasting an example. Well, yeah, that really should work. And maybe that's a good first step to check that your environment is set up correctly. But then you should do something different. Maybe it's your own set of data and a slightly different user interface, or whatever it is you're learning about. Try a different example for polymorphism, etc. If you just use the example, you're not really proving that you can create something. And it's much better to work out the problems that you'll face when trying to create something now when you're trying to learn it than when you're trying to really use it in a useful context, where the key at that point is, I want to get to working code. Because you may well find that at that point, you'll take some shortcuts. Well, I don't really know why this works, but I need to finish this feature, so I'll do it. Well, when you're in learn mode, you're not just trying to get something done. If something doesn't work as you expect it to, that's a great time to dive into, why doesn't it work? What's a better way of doing this? And then you can use that later on without trying to mix learning about the thing I didn't understand properly and finishing this feature. What do we end up with in learn mode? Well, we may well have throwaway code, and I'll talk a little bit more about keeping code later on. But so you may have some simple examples of what's the simplest WPF application I can create, or maybe what's the simplest one that uses some data binding. Doesn't bind to a database or anything like that, but it just uses a hard-coded list set up in maybe a view model. Maybe you're trying to investigate MVVM as a pattern. So some code that you have written, not just copy-pasted examples, some notes on bits that were unclear to start with from just the resource you were learning from, but that you've now worked out your better way of understanding something. Well, don't lose that information. Anything that you've had to work hard to come up with, you should definitely write down some notes, and you can come back to them later on and reinforce things. And hopefully a load of bookmarks of good resources that you have used and good resources that you want to investigate later on. The second mode, and we'll need to speed up a little bit, is explore mode. Now, this is not quite the same as learn, and I've got a note there saying I'm unsure how different this is. I've been sort of thinking about this, and I think for me, explore is more about, well, I don't have the resources. No one has documented this protocol, so I need to reverse engineer it, or no one has tried to work out how to combine these two frameworks together, so I need to do that work for myself. I'm going into the dark, hoping to light the way. So I'm writing a load of code that may or may not be any use at all, may or may not work, but I'm rapidly exploring avenues. So in this mode, you definitely want to validate what you've done as accurately and as early as possible, and keep everything you've tried, because it may well be that you try something and it doesn't work first time. So you go back and say, okay, I'll try something else. And then an hour later, you work out why that first approach that is the nicest, simplest, and you were just missing one thing. Well, if you've still got that code, it's easier to work from that. So I'm not very good at actually keeping all of the code that I've been working on, but I would say use Git or some other source control system really liberally here. Feel free to commit stuff saying, end of attempt 1, and have a notebook that says what you were trying to attempt in each case. So the Git commit messages don't need to be perfect production quality, but they should be enough so that with the notes, you know where to go back to if you need to come back to things. You don't need to worry about production code quality, but think about naming, and in particular, write comments. If you've done something and it works, but you're not quite sure why, then make a note of that and keep a comment saying, I should revisit this at some point. Unit tests. I have nothing against unit tests, and it may come across as if I do sometimes in this talk. I would say write tests if they're going to be helpful for you. Maybe writing a unit test is your easiest way of exploring things. If you're really keen on TDD, then your brain may work so that your best way of learning is to write a test. That's absolutely fantastic. In other cases, you may well find that writing a simple console app or even a GUI or whatever it is helps you explore quicker, and writing tests, particularly for an approach that you think you may well throw away in 5 minutes time. Well, do I really want to write tests to prove that the code works for the bit that I do understand exactly as I'd want it to? Well, you would do so for production code, won't help in explore mode. So while I'm doing this, I'm thinking, what am I learning and what things are working? But I'm also trying to get some sense of what the production code might look like. What are the abstractions? What are the big bits of architecture? How am I going to organize things later on? And also, can I get to something that is not just a purely random demo of, well, I can make a request to this server and come back, but can I do something that looks and feels useful, even if it's really clunky kind of useful? Often the difference between making one request to a server and getting a response back and building something that is clunky but useful is that vision of what abstraction do I want when I come to write really useful code. At the end of this, you'll end up with a load of code that is really horrible. You don't want anyone else to see it. Keep it anyway. Keep notes with it. And you'll have something to come back to, particularly if you end up having to set that aside for 6 months and then come back to it later. It's really useful to have that clunky but working code. So that's explore mode. Understand mode. Again, this sounds so similar to explore, but in this particular case, it's because the system already exists and you are trying to trace a path through it. So this is usually in terms of, I need to fix a bug. It may be, I need to implement a new feature, but this is a new code base. I don't really understand how it works at the moment, so I want to take some time to go through it. So you're not typically writing a lot of code here, unlike in the explore mode, but you're stepping through code, maybe writing code just to exercise the existing code and taking loads of really careful notes, maybe adding some logging, doing some debugging, maybe writing tests here, maybe taking the subsystem that you actually need to work on, and maybe it's a subsystem of a giant web app, but you can transplant that subsystem into a simpler context. Again, for me, that's almost always a console application, and then work on it to understand it better and test it with a quicker cycle, and that can help speed things up. Crucially, when you're in understand mode, you want to avoid assuming things, particularly avoid assuming that the problem is in one particular place if you're fixing a bug, because often we're terrible at making assumptions. The number of Stack Overflow questions I have seen saying, I'm 100% sure this code is correct, but there must be a compiler bug, there must be a library bug because it doesn't do what I want it to. Well, in almost every case, turns out, nope, there really was a bug. The problem is in your code, and the reason you can't find it is you've assumed that the problem is not in your code. If you assume that you can't possibly have left your car keys in the kitchen, then that's going to be the one place you don't look. And so if the car keys are actually in the kitchen, then it'll take you ages to find them. So try not to have assumptions. Write careful notes that are accurate, lots of copy pasting, and just come as objectively as you can. Try to reproduce things, ideally completely reliably. If I do this, then it always triggers the bug. If I do this, it never triggers the bug. If I do this one other thing, then sometimes it triggers the bug. That can be really useful because you then say, okay, how can I change that sometimes it triggers and veer towards always or veer towards never? And that's where you get really useful information. You're also trying to isolate things, so reduce the amount of the system that you're concerned about. And that's where if you start with no assumptions, I will try X and then try Y. Okay, it looks like I can remove the database from this and change this to use hard-coded data, and that's where you are changing code, but not in a way that you want to put into production later on. So see if you can chop out half of the system. Can I still reproduce the problem? Yes. Okay, you're not going to assume that that means the other half of the system is perfect, but at least that you can address some of the issue without worrying about that first half. At the end of this, you end up with hopefully a load of notes, sometimes a new bug report, or if you're investigating a bug that someone else has reported to you, you can say, okay, well, thank you for your 5,000 line GUI app that demonstrated the problem. I've managed to reproduce this in this 10-line console app. I'm now going to work on fixing it. And that step is a really, really useful one because it just eliminates a load of the garbage aspects. Sometimes you may end up with some new tests that show which bits are working. You may end up with some failed tests, which are, if I can fix this unit test, then chances are that will fix the underlying bug. But we're not trying to fix it yet, because fixing is a separate mode. So now we've moved from the just understanding things first 3 modes to making changes to our production code. These 3 other modes, which are fix, enhance, and cleanup. This is just in case I run out of time. So the goal of fix mode is to fix 1 bug. Now, that doesn't mean fixing 1 line of code, because you may find that there are other places, one conceptual bug can come up in multiple different places. I mentioned digital audio mixes earlier on. I had a bug where I wasn't cleaning things up properly, so I would end up with UDP ports being open for too long. Well, when I fix it for 1 mixer, I should have a look and see whether the same thing is the case for other mixers, but I won't at the same time fix, oh, I'm not observing a timeout over there. Well, that's a different bug, so I will make a note of it, but I won't fix it right now. If you can write a unit test for it, depends on what you're working on. Some bugs are much easier to unit test than others, but definitely look at doing so if you can. And you want to change as little as you can without introducing new problems. If you need a bigger change, then you might want to think about cleanup of refactoring before you fix the bug. Look for other things that are the same kind of pattern, the same real bug. Like, the same thing was wrong in my head when I wrote these 3 different bits of code versus, oh, well, I'm only looking at 1 bit of code, but I can see 3 different things that were wrong in my head when I wrote it. Write down on your task list that you need to fix those things, file other issues, etc. That's all fine, but try to keep the change to 1 bug. Aside from anything else, assuming you're using code review, it's much easier to review, I'm just fixing this 1 thing. Maybe you'll create 1 PR with 3 commits that fix 3 bugs, all in a similar area, but it can be 3 separate commits, which is easier to read. So in the end, we'll either have a pull request, which fixes the bug. Sometimes it's unclear how you should fix the bug, so you need a design doc with some different options and maybe 3 different branches where you've implemented them all and you just need to work out which is the best way of doing it. Sometimes you've reported multiple other bugs or fixed multiple bugs in the same pull request. So that's fixing. Enhance is like a simple term for everything that makes the code more useful. So we're implementing a single feature, and where does one feature stop? Where do you do things in stages? That's a whole other talk. If you need to refactor in order to implement this feature, consider refactoring first and then implementing the feature. This is where I often come unstuck. I work out when I'm halfway through implementing a feature, oh, it's really hard to do things with the code, with the rest of the code as it is. I should refactor. And my mistake is that I then start the refactoring while halfway through implementing. And then it's really hard to do that. So what I should do, and what I found does work in practice, is commit my work in progress. Go back to main or whatever and then do the refactoring in a separate commit. Be happy, and you've got to know what you'll want in the new feature, but you can refactor the existing code, have a commit that just does a fairly pure refactor, and then go back to implementing the feature in a much nicer context. In order to get the goal actually achieved, try to make it really done, not most of the way there. So try to avoid the to-dos, try to avoid saying, oh, we should test this at some point. I'm sure I'll do that next week. You know you won't. You'll have some other feature to do. Try to do it all in one go. Make sure you've got all the copyright notices, you've added XML comments where it's appropriate, you've got nice formatting, etc. Don't make it so that when you come back to this code, you think, oh, I wish I'd finished that properly the first time. What I'm thinking about when I'm in this mode, have I actually done enough pre-work? So have I explored enough? I don't want to be trying to learn new things about the language or the protocol or the framework while I'm building the feature. Do I know what I'm trying to build? Will I know when I'm done? And how will I know when I'm done in terms of quality as well as just the feature itself? And as I said, we end up with a single pull request, and maybe that's multiple repos with multiple, one pull request per repo. It's high quality code, ready for code review. If we had a requirements document, maybe we haven't quite implemented exactly the requirements because it turned out they didn't make as much sense when you implement them. So I've modified the document. Everything is in a good, stable equilibrium. It's a good place to be. Finally, cleanup mode. So this might be refactoring. It might be simple cleanup, like removing using directives, improving comments, reformatting, all of these things that don't change whether or not the code works and don't change how much the code is capable of doing, but may well make it easier to fix the bugs and easier to implement new features. I would strongly encourage making cleanups easy to review by thinking about, there are some cleanups like formatting that are, or removing using directives. Reviewing those doesn't require any thought, which is great. You skim over it at a really fast pace. Right, I've reviewed that commit. The other kind of refactoring commit could be redesigning an abstraction. So yes, the overall code still achieves the same things, but it could be a radically different design. And someone reviewing that will need to think about it carefully, need to review the code really carefully. You don't want them to have a load of code, 2,000 lines of code to review, 1,200 of which are just white space and comments and removing using directives. But it's quite hard to start skimming, because if you skim, you might miss the 800 lines that are really, I need to be thinking about this in order to review. So separate those into different commits and they're much easier to review. What am I thinking about in this mode? I'm thinking about, what have I noticed? Like, when you're working in code, you often notice things saying, oh, I should come back to that at some point. And when you're refactoring, that's a good point at which to say, I've thought that about 4 times now, and I've never bothered to do it. Now I will do it in a new commit just for that one thing. If you see an issue in terms of using directives or formatting or design issue, it's not necessarily a bug, but it's something that you want to change. If it's happened in one place, might it happen in several others? If you find that something, the file is in the wrong folder compared with the namespace, well, check all the other namespaces as well. In terms of pattern matching and the rule of 3, so if you find you've got lots of code that's the same in multiple places, you will be tempted to say, can I abstract that and deduplicate it? Personally, I'm fine with having the same code in 2 different places. When it comes to 3 places, that's when I find I need to refactor and do it. But don't worry about, oh, well, I've got it in 2 places, therefore I must abstract this out. That can often end up being counterproductive. And what do we end up with? Pull requests that clean things up, and the world is a nicer place to work. So I think I've run out of time pretty much where I expected to. I believe we now have a bit of time within this session for any questions or comments, discussion and feedback, and then obviously I will join Discord to answer more questions in a chat mode there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the great talk. It's always interesting to get inside someone else's head and understand how things are going and what problems, what challenges. And we have a questions, quite a lot of them. So the first question from audience is, for how long do you usually keep notes? Like you're taking a lot of notes, but it's probably a struggle to keep them up and destroy them from
I
time
try
to
to
time.
keep. I meant to mention this, but it was quite a short time slot. I keep notes in Google Docs, so they'll never go away. And make sure you've got titles that you'll be able to find them later on. When I'm fixing issues or understanding issues, I will usually create. I've got a whole separate directory. I've got a GitHub directory that's got my local clones of repos, and an issues directory that's still split into different repos, and then a directory of issue 1023, and then in there a C# project, etc. I don't tend to back those up, and I potentially should, so those last as long as the laptop I'm working on, because they're useful if it turns out that someone else finds the same problem a month later. They don't tend to be useful 2 years later, but it certainly wouldn't hurt to have a separate repo for, or maybe a separate separate branch for just keeping track of the issues of that repo. Keep everything. The other benefit of not having them in source control is it doesn't matter if I put my Google Cloud project ID or other sensitive things. Maybe I would hard code an OAuth token just for the sake of doing that. So be careful who you're sharing this with, but put as much effort into keeping them as you think will be useful. So notes can be really useful when you come back to, why did I do that thing 5 years ago? The number of times I've wished I've had notes for that, whereas a small program to demonstrate a problem, well, if I fix the problem, it's less likely to be useful in 5 years' time.
Yeah, thank you. It's always interesting how to do these things. And point about secrets, it's super useful also, because people tend to forget about this.
Yeah, it's very easy to do.
So another question: how do you think? What would you suggest on how to fix bad thinking patterns? So, like, I know developers who trying to fix a bug without like any second thought. They just see some issue, they have idea, they don't do any tests. They do not ask questions.
So the first thing I would do is try to model what you think is best practice, and try to be clear about that. So I'm working in a team of 6 or 7, one of whom I have worked with for a long time, and so I'm used to sharing my design docs with her. I'm now sharing them with the rest of the team, not as a please review this design doc, but hey, this is what I look for in a design doc, because that's the kind of design doc I'm creating. So these might be good examples for you. They're newer to the product than I am. So there's modeling things. It can be very difficult if the person who's behaving badly, as it were, is more senior than you. That's definitely a difficult thing. But just asking, can I ask how you found this to be the problem, or do you mind if I write a unit test for this? That sort of encourages. You've got to do it kindly is the really challenging thing. I'm big on kindness, and I would encourage everyone to take a moment anytime you're finding yourself getting aggravated by a colleague or yourself. Be kind to yourself too, and say, how can I give this feedback in a way that is clear? You don't want to be saying, oh, well, maybe you might consider. There's something about being straightforward, but doing so in a constructive and kind way. That's a really tough skill. It's a skill that I think we should be conscious and aware that we need to put effort into, and we'll get better at it. And I'm certainly not going to say, oh yeah, I know how to be kind and critical at the same time all the time. I'm perfect at this. Far from it. But I hope that by being conscious of it, I'm gradually improving.
Great. Then maybe the last question. What is your thought process under pressure? Like when production is down and you need to figure things out?
So I'm really lucky that the product that I work on is libraries where, you know, we don't really have down. The worst that could happen, and it would be dreadful, would be we publish a NuGet package that somehow has some malware in, and if people use it, it will destroy their hard disk or, you know, rack up, you know, start trying to mine bitcoins on their GCP account or something. So it's been a while. I have been in that situation though. I would say the first thing to think about is how can I de-stress as quickly as possible? So what's the shortest way to making things better enough that I can then take a bit more time? So any decision that I make under pressure is likely to be less well thought through than things out of pressure. So how can I stop the bleeding, as it were, get production to maybe still degraded, but good enough that I can take a step back. I'm a big fan of taking a step back. How can I really understand this and then still split the work into short-term fixes to get it back working fully, and then longer term, how do I stop this from happening again? But working out how to relieve that pressure on yourself, and maybe all I need to do in order to relieve pressure on myself is say, I need to call Jeff, Bob, Jill, and Jane, and then get them all involved and split things up. Right, Jane, you fix the authorization issue. Jeff put up a holding page saying, we're sorry that there's a problem, we're working on it. You know, someone else do social media. How can I share this so that I can relax just a little bit? Not relax, but take a breath and make better decisions. That should be the goal. And definitely the thing you don't want to be doing is, right, I'm under pressure, I can be the hero here. Heroes have as little place in software engineering as possible. Teams can be great. Heroes fail under pressure.
Thank you. It was really, really great insights. I think that audience will enjoy them and rethink again. Okay, we're almost out of time. I want to thank you for the great talk and great Q&A session. And hopefully you will be able in a few years, when it will be safe and sound, travel to Ukraine, travel to Kiev, attend in offline. And if there will be opportunity, we would gladly meet you in Odessa by the sea. We have a great .NET user group, and you helped already tons of developers in our user group and in Ukraine in general on Stack Overflow. So hopefully it will be a great opportunity soon to see you in person on Ukrainian events. Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time. It was a great talk.
Thank you. See you on Discord, folks.